The red ink on the test paper burned like a brand across Marcus Whitfield's vision. Another F. Another failure. Another lie he'd have to cover up before his father found out. And, as he crumpled the paper in his trembling hands, standing alone in the marble hallway of Whitfield Academy, the most expensive private school money could buy, he wondered how much longer he could keep pretending he belonged there. How many more times he could smile through the shame. How many more nights he could stare at textbooks that might as well have been written in a foreign language, until a soft voice behind him said, "You know, throwing it away doesn't make it disappear." And he turned to see Alina Rodriguez, the quiet girl who came to school in second-hand uniforms, whose mother cleaned his family's mansion every Tuesday and Friday, holding a stack of library books against her chest, her dark eyes filled not with judgment, but with something that looked almost like understanding. Marcus felt his face flush hot with embarrassment and anger. The last person he wanted to witness his failure was the scholarship kid, the maid's daughter, someone who had every reason to enjoy watching the billionaire's son fall apart, but before he could snap at her or walk away, Alina stepped closer and said quietly, "I failed my first 3 tests when I started here too. You know, because being smart in a public school is different from being prepared for a place like this. And no amount of money or pressure makes the words stick if you're studying the wrong way." And something in her voice, a gentleness without pity, made Marcus freeze, made him actually look at her, really look, and see not the invisible girl he'd barely noticed for 3 years, but someone who seemed to carry a light he'd never recognized before. "What do you mean, the wrong way?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, and Alina glanced down the empty hallway before saying, "Meet me in the library after last period, if you actually want to pass your next test. If you're willing to let someone like me help someone like you." And though her words could have been bitter, they weren't. They were simply honest. A door being opened, an offer he didn't deserve but desperately needed. Dan. So that afternoon, Marcus found himself sitting across from Alina at a corner table in the library, surrounded by her careful notes and color-coded flashcards, watching as she explained, "The secret isn't studying harder, Marcus. It's studying with purpose, with a reason that matters more than grades, or fear, or making your parents proud. You have to find the why before the what makes any sense." And he stared at her, confused, because he'd had tutors and test prep coaches and every educational advantage money could provide, but no one had ever asked him why he wanted to learn. They'd only told him that he must, that his future demanded it, that the Whitfield name required it. Alina opened her worn notebook and showed him something he'd never seen before, not just notes on biology or history, but little notes to herself in the margins, connections she'd made, questions she wanted to explore, small drawings that helped her remember. And she explained, "When my mom cleans houses, she tells me stories about every family, about how they built their lives. And she always says that knowledge is the only thing no one can take from you, the only inheritance that matters. Because she came here from Mexico with nothing but a 6th-grade education and the determination that I would have more, that I would have everything she couldn't give herself. So when I study chemistry, I'm not memorizing formulas, I'm honoring her sacrifice. I'm building the future she crossed a desert to give me, and that makes every single word worth remembering." And as she spoke, Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest, something he'd kept locked and frozen for so long. He'd forgotten it was there, the weight of being Richard Whitfield's son, of growing up in a 50-room mansion that felt empty even when filled with people, of having a father whose approval came in the form of stock portfolios and disappointed silences, of never being asked what he wanted because it was assumed he'd want what all Whitfields wanted. And suddenly he understood that he'd been failing, not because he was stupid, but because he'd been trying to learn for all the wrong reasons. Trying to be someone he didn't understand, chasing a finish line that had no meaning to him. "I don't know what my why is," Marcus admitted, and the words felt like the most honest thing he'd said in years. And Alina nodded slowly, not surprised, and asked, "Then what makes you forget time? What makes you curious? What would you do if no one was watching and nothing was expected? And Marcus sat with the question, really sat with it, and finally said, I like building things. Taking things apart and putting them back together. Understanding how they work. Have a whole workshop in the East Wing that no one knows about, full of old computers and engines and radios. Things I fix just because I want to know how. And Elena's face lit up with a smile that transformed her entirely. And she said, then that's where we start. Every formula in physics is about how things work. Every equation is a blueprint. Every concept is a tool. And if you can see learning as building something instead of filling a requirement, maybe it'll finally stick. Over the next 6 weeks, Marcus and Elena met every day after school, and slowly, something remarkable happened, not just in Marcus's grades, though those did begin to climb from F's to D's to C's, and then, miraculously, to B's, but in the way he saw the world, the way he saw himself, and most of all, the way he saw Elena, whose brilliance had been invisible to him only because he'd never bothered to look, whose quiet determination put his privileged complaints to shame, whose mother Rosa he'd passed 1,000 times in his own home without ever really seeing her, without ever saying more than a distracted hello, without ever considering that the woman who scrubbed his family's floors was working 2 jobs to pay for Elena's school supplies, that every scholarship covered tuition but not books or uniforms, or the 1,000 small expenses that came with attending a school designed for the wealthy. One afternoon, Marcus arrived at the library to find Elena with her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking, and when he asked what was wrong, she showed him a letter the school was implementing a new enhancement fee for lab sciences. $500 per semester, mandatory for all students, and though she'd won every academic award the school offered, this wasn't covered by scholarship, and her mother had already picked up weekend shifts, had already sacrificed so much, and Elena couldn't bear to ask for more. Couldn't bear to be the reason her mother's hands were raw and her back ached and her dreams were deferred again and again. Marcus stared at the letter, at the casual way it announced a fee that was nothing to families like his but everything to families like Elena, and for the first time in his life, he felt the hot, clarifying burn of righteous anger, the recognition of an injustice that his privilege had always shielded him from seeing, and without thinking, he said, I'll pay it. But Elena pulled back immediately, her eyes flashing, and said, no, absolutely not. I don't want your charity. I don't want to be your project, or your guilt relief. And Marcus realized he'd offered the easiest thing, the thing that required nothing of him but money, the thing that would make him feel better without actually changing anything. So he took a breath and said, then let me do something harder. Let me help you talk to the administration. Let me use my name the way you've been using your knowledge. Because if they're going to listen to anyone, they'll listen to a Whitfield, and maybe for once that name can do something good. Together, they crafted a proposal, researched scholarship enhancement policies at other schools, gathered data on students who were being silently pushed out by these small fees, and Marcus did something he'd never done before. He went to his father's study, knocked on the heavy oak door, and asked not for money, but for time, for attention, for help understanding how to make a case to the school board, and Richard Whitfield, who'd been watching his son's mysterious transformation with cautious curiosity, who'd seen the grades rising and the sullenness fading and something like purpose emerging, set down his papers and listened. Why does this matter to you? Richard asked, his voice neutral, his eyes sharp, and Marcus could have deflected, could have made it about fairness in the abstract, but instead he said, because I've been getting everything handed to me my whole life, and still failing, while Elena gets nothing handed to her, and succeeds at everything. And the only difference is that she has a reason to work, and I never did, and her mom Rosa, who cleans our house, she's sacrificing everything so Elena can have what I've been wasting, and that's not right, Dad, it's just not right. And for a long moment, Richard was silent, his expression unreadable, before he said quietly, Rosa's daughter is the one who's been helping you. And Marcus nodded, and Richard said, "Your mother and I thought you'd hired another expensive tutor." And Marcus shook his head and said, "She won't take a penny from me. She just helps because she thinks everyone deserves a chance to learn the right way." And something shifted in Richard's face, something almost like shame, almost like recognition. The school board meeting was on a Thursday evening, and Marcus sat in the audience with Alina, both of them in their school uniforms, both of them nervous and prepared. And when the time came for public comment, Marcus stood and delivered the speech they'd written together, his voice steady despite his racing heart, laying out the data, the stories of students who'd quietly withdrawn, the gap between the school's mission statement about excellence and opportunity, and the reality of fees that excluded anyone without family wealth. And he ended by saying, "I'm standing here because someone who had every reason to ignore me chose to help me instead. Someone who understands that education isn't about what you can afford, but about what you're willing to work for. And if this school really believes in merit, then we need to put our money where our mission is." And when he sat down, Alina squeezed his hand once, quickly, and he saw his father in the back row, sitting next to a woman Marcus suddenly recognized as Rosa, both of them watching with expressions he couldn't quite read. The board voted to establish an enhancement fee fund, subsidized by a new alumni contribution program that Richard Whitfield personally pledged to match for the first 3 years. And as people filed out of the meeting room, Rosa approached Marcus for the first time as more than a background presence, looked him in the eye, and said in careful English, "Thank you for seeing my daughter, for letting her see you too." And Marcus felt tears burn his eyes because he understood that she wasn't just thanking him for the policy change but for something deeper, for recognizing Elena's worth, for being changed by her kindness instead of diminished by it, for letting himself be taught by someone his world had told him to overlook him. He managed to say, "She saved me, Mrs. Rodriguez. She really did. And I'm sorry it took me so long to notice her, to notice you, to notice what's been right in front of me." And Rosa nodded, her eyes glistening, and said, "Sometimes we only see when we're ready to look." The next day at school, something had shifted. Students who'd watched Marcus and Alina studying together, who'd seen them present at the board meeting, started asking Alina for help, started inviting her to study groups, started seeing her the way Marcus had learned to see her, not as the scholarship kid but as the brightest person in their class. And Marcus watched his former friends, the ones who'd helped him cheat and blow off classes and waste every advantage, with new eyes. And he realized he didn't want to be that person anymore, didn't want to sleepwalk through a life of privilege and purpose, didn't want to become another Richard Whitfield, sitting in a big office wondering where his life had gone. And when his father asked him, over a rare dinner together, what he wanted to do with his future, Marcus surprised himself by saying, "I want to build things, design things, maybe engineering or architecture. Something where I can take broken things and make them work again." And Richard was quiet for a long moment before saying, "I wanted to be a teacher once, before my father told me that Whitfields didn't work for salaries. They built empires, and I listened. And I've spent 30 years wondering what my life would have been if I'd had the courage you're showing now." And it was the most honest conversation they'd ever had. The first time Marcus had seen his father as a full person, someone who'd also been bent and shaped by expectations, someone who'd also lost himself in the process. And though it didn't erase years of distance, it was a beginning, a small bridge across a vast gap. On the last day of junior year, Marcus opened his final report card with hands that only trembled slightly, and there it was, a 3.4 GPA, not perfect, but earned, really earned. Every single grade the result of actual learning and actual work. And he found Alina by her locker and showed her without words. And she threw her arms around him in a hug that was brief but fierce, and she said, "I knew you could do it. I knew you had it in you." And he said, "I couldn't have without you, without the secret." And she pulled back, smiling, and said, You know the secret wasn't really a secret, right? It was just caring. Just finding a reason to try. And Marcus nodded and said, I know, but that was everything. That was the one thing I didn't have. And he pulled out an envelope and handed it to her, and when she opened it, confused, she found a letter he'd written, not to her, but about her, nominating her for a national scholarship program, he'd discovered, one that covered not just college tuition, but living expenses, study abroad, research opportunities, everything she'd need to build the future her mother had dreamed of. And he'd included a recommendation that he'd asked his father to co-sign. The first thing they'd worked on together. And Elena's eyes filled with tears as she read it, as she saw herself described as the most brilliant and generous person I've ever known. Someone who gives freely of her knowledge and expects nothing in return. Someone who sees potential where others see problems. Someone who changed my life by believing I could change. And she looked up at Marcus and whispered, You didn't have to do this? And he said, Yes, I did. Because you taught me that the point of having advantages isn't to hoard them, but to extend them. To pull people up instead of keeping them out. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what you gave me. Summer came. And Marcus did something he'd never done before. He asked Rosa if he could help her with her work. Not his charity, but his learning. And twice a week he showed up at the houses she cleaned, and he cleaned alongside her. Scrubbing bathrooms and vacuuming floors and folding laundry. And at first she protested, horrified at the idea of Richard Whitfield's son on his hands and knees with a scrub brush. But Marcus insisted, said he needed to understand what work really meant, what sacrifice really cost. And slowly Rosa led him, and as they worked, she told him stories about her journey north, about leaving her parents and siblings to give Alina a chance, about the years of invisible labor, about the pride she felt every time Alina brought home an award, every time her daughter succeeded in a world that wasn't built for girls like her. And Marcus listened and learned and felt his perspective shift and expand in ways that no classroom ever could have taught him. When Alina won the national scholarship in August, a full ride to MIT, with a stipend that meant her mother could finally cut back her hours, could finally rest, could finally see the sacrifice pay off. The whole Rodriguez family celebrated, and Marcus and his father were invited to the small party in Elena's modest apartment. And Richard Whitfield sat at a folding table, eating homemade tamales, and speaking in halting Spanish with Rosa. And Marcus saw his father laugh, really laugh, for the first time in years. Saw him relaxed and human and humbled by the warmth of people who had every reason to resent him, but chose grace instead. And on the drive home, Richard said quietly, I've been living in that big house for 20 years, and never really invited anyone in, never really let anyone matter. And I think I've been very lonely, Marcus. I think we both have. And Marcus reached over and squeezed his father's shoulder and said, We can do better. We can be better. And Richard nodded, his eyes bright, and said, Yes, I think maybe we can. Senior year, Marcus became a peer tutor, offering what Alina had given him, not just academic help, but the belief that everyone had the capacity to learn if they could find their why, if they could connect education to purpose instead of obligation. And he and Alina co-founded a program that paired scholarship students with resources and mentorship, breaking down the invisible barriers that money created. And slowly, the culture of the school began to shift, became less about who had what, and more about who was willing to work, who was willing to help, who was willing to see each other as fully human. And on graduation day, Alina gave the valedictorian speech, her voice clear and strong, and she said, We've been taught that success is individual, that we rise by our own merit and fall by our own failure. But the truth I've learned is that we are all connected, all responsible for each other, and the measure of our success isn't what we achieve, but what we help others achieve, who we lift as we climb, who we see when everyone else looks away. And she looked directly at Marcus when she said, Sometimes the greatest gift we can give is believing in someone before they believe in themselves. And sometimes the greatest gift we can receive is letting ourselves be helped, letting ourselves be changed, letting ourselves admit we don't have all the answers. And the audience rose in a standing ovation, and Marcus stood with them, tears streaming down his face, not caring who saw, not caring about anything except the overwhelming gratitude he felt for the quiet girl who'd offered him a second chance, who'd shown him that real wealth wasn't in bank accounts, but in purpose and connection and the courage to grow. Marcus went on to study engineering at Stanford, and true to his word, he focused on sustainable design, on building things that solved problems for people who'd been overlooked. And he called Alina every week, comparing notes, sharing struggles, maintaining the friendship that had saved him. And when he came home for winter break, he insisted on visiting Rosa, bringing flowers and sitting in her living room, telling her how her daughter was thriving, how she was already being recruited for research positions, how her sacrifice had created ripples that would extend for generations. And Rosa cried and said, "You are a good boy. You have a good heart. You just needed to find it." And Marcus said, "Your daughter showed me where to look." Years later, when Marcus stood at his father's retirement party, preparing to take over the restructured Whitfield Foundation, now focused on educational equity and scholarship funding, he told the assembled donors and board members about a crumpled test paper and a girl with library books, and a question that changed everything. "Why do you want to learn?" And he said, "The secret to success, the secret to a life that matters, isn't working harder or wanting more. It's finding a purpose bigger than yourself. It's letting yourself be changed by people who have less, but understand more. It's recognizing that we're all failing until someone shows us we don't have to fail alone." And in the audience, Alina sat next to her mother, now a graduate student completing her doctorate, on track to become Dr. Rodriguez, and she caught Marcus's eye and smiled, and he smiled back, and in that moment, they both understood that the real transformation hadn't been in grades or programs or policies, but in the simple, revolutionary act of seeing each other, of letting a barrier break down, of choosing connection over comfort, and that everything good that followed had grown from that one brave choice. That one generous moment, that one secret that was never really a secret at all, just the ancient, powerful truth that we need each other, that we're saved by letting ourselves be known, and that kindness, real kindness, is the force that changes everything.